Hello. In this lecture, I'm going to give an overview of some of the research work that's going on in my lab. My lab is called Computational Neuroscience Laboratory or CNS Laboratory. We are located in the Department of Biotechnology, also called Bhupat and Jyoti Mehta School of Biosciences in IIT Madras campus. And you can see our building, it's a pretty nice building, and we have one more building that's just coming up right in front of this building. And you're most welcome to visit us sometime. So I'll talk about two main areas. In fact, the main research interest in our lab is computational neuroscience, because that's the name of the lab. And here we are looking at three main topics: modeling basal ganglia, which is a part of it's a subcortical circuit in the brain, which is a very important circuit. Then modeling neurovascular interactions, that is, how do neurons and vessels talk to each other? So how do neurons send their hunger signals and get energy feedback from the vessels? So we are modeling that, and we're also modeling hippocampus and its role in spatial navigation. In addition to these three topics, we are also modeling, we are also studying a separate script called Bharti. Bharti script is a script that we have developed in this lab. It's being proposed as a common script for the entire country. So I'll talk more about that later in the last part of the lecture. So if you come to the first topic, modeling basal ganglia, like I said, basal ganglia is a subcortical circuit. It's a set of about 7 deep brain nuclei, subcortical nuclei. These are connected, as shown in this figure here. So cortex sends input to the basal ganglia to a particular pair of nuclei called caudate and putamen. Together they are called the striatum. And from there, information goes through several nuclei, through several loops that are located within the basal ganglia. And output of basal ganglia goes back to the cortex via thalamus. So let us look at the circuitry in a more simplified engineering style block diagram, as you can see in this picture. So see the input coming into the basal ganglia from the cortex at the top, and these connections are glutamatergic, and these connections come to the striatum. From striatum, information goes further on via a straight pathway which goes further down, as you can see in the figure, to two nuclei, GPI and SNR. Then further on, these projections from GPI and SNR go to thalamus, and from thalamus the projections go to the cortex, so thereby closing the loop. So input to the basal ganglia comes from cortex and output goes back to the cortex, forming a loop. Then from striatum to GPI and SNR, there is a longer route going via the GPE, as you can see that pink block box, and from GPE to STN to again GPI and SNR, and again back to thalamus and cortex. So you can see that there is a shorter route from striatum to GPI/SNR. That is called the direct pathway for obvious reasons. Then there is a longer or indirect route from striatum to the GPI or SNR. So striatum, GPE, STN, and GPI/SNR. This is called the indirect pathway. I'm not really elaborating the names of the nuclei. They are given here on the slides, but you could just call them XYZ if you like. But the point is, this is the kind of an architecture that is present in the basal ganglia circuit. So now this circuit is very important because it has wide-ranging functions in the brain. So in fact, if you divide the functions of the brain, the major functional domains of the brain as motor, that's related to movement, and cognitive, thinking, and higher brain functions. Then affective are related to emotions, or autonomic related to the control of the internal organs or viscera. Right, these are the 4 major functions of the brain. Now, basal ganglia has a role in all these 4 major domains. And so here is a short list of some of those functions. In fact, there are a lot more functions. These functions shown here are like action selection. How do you choose an action from one of many competing actions? Or how do you perform a sequential movement? How do you perform goal-directed behavior and reward-based learning and timing and so on and so forth? So it has a wide range of functions, and so that's why the famous British neurologist Marsden, spoke of the mysterious motor functions of basal ganglia, because it's really quite puzzling how the same subcortical circuit, so it's a very small circuit, right? How can this circuit perform such wide-ranging motor functions? And this is a major puzzle, like in neuroscience. And also damage or any dysfunction in the basal ganglia circuitry can be associated with a lot of both neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders. Some of them are shown in this slide. Like Parkinson's is a major disorder which is associated with loss of cells in this little circuit in the basal ganglia. So you see that small yellow box named SNC, it stands for substantia nigra pars compacta. So neurons here release a chemical called dopamine, which is a very important chemical that coordinates a lot of activities of basal ganglia. Now SNC projects to mainly to striatum, which is what is shown in this figure, but it also projects to all the other nuclei of basal ganglia like ST, GP, GPI, and so on. So in Parkinson's disease, or specifically a kind of a variation of PD called idiopathic Parkinson's, there is a loss of dopamine cells in SNC. It's not known why these cells are dying, but loss of these cells in this very small nucleus, consisting of maybe about a few 100,000 neurons, right, gives rise to a wide variety of symptoms in all the four major domains of basal ganglia, that is motor, cognitive, affective, and autonomic. So the question is, how can loss of cells in this small nucleus can have such wide-ranging symptoms? Okay, so then there is other diseases like schizophrenia, which is a neuropsychiatric disorder, right? Then you have obsessive compulsive disorder, then attention deficit hyperkinetic disorder, or ADHD, then Huntington's disease, which is a strongly genetic disorder, then Tourette syndrome, ethetosis, even stammering, right? So there are so many different neurological neuropsychiatric conditions which are associated with basal ganglia dysfunction. So if you understand basal ganglia's function, you can get insight into all these diseases, and that's primarily the motivation of our lab in studying basal ganglia. Now obviously understanding brain structure means understanding it obviously quantitatively and not just through verbal loose arguments. So there are lots of computational models proposed to explain basal ganglia functions over the years. In fact, the modeling efforts in this area date back to the 80s. So there are many schools of thought, many different lines of approaches in modeling. Some of them are shown in this figure, and there are actually a lot more models. These are not, these are no way the complete listing of different modeling studies of basal ganglia. So, but thing is, there are many different schools of thought, and there's no integration, there's no cohesiveness in all these different schools of thought. So current understanding of basal ganglia looks a lot like this bunch of blind monks trying to figure out what an elephant looks like. That each monk thinks differently about the elephant, and no single person has a comprehensive view, and that's pretty much summarizes the state of research in basal ganglia too. So specifically, we are interested in understanding Parkinson's disease, getting an insight into Parkinson's, so that if you develop a good model which can explain various symptoms of Parkinson's disease, then can we use the model for treatment. That's the main objective in our lab's research. So PD is called a progressive neurodegenerative disorder because there is a loss of cells in SNC. It's progressive, you cannot stop this degradation. At the best, through medication, you can slow down this degradation a little bit, but you cannot stop it. And then the pathology here is loss of cells in the substantia nigra. And there are four important symptoms called the cardinal symptoms of PD. These are tremor, rigidity, postural abnormalities, and bradykinesia. And motor symptoms alone, there are wide-ranging motor symptoms, like for example, affecting reaching movements. How do you move your hand to reach something, or how do you write? How does your handwriting look like? Eye movements and speech and posture, right? Because in this disease, all these different motor modalities can be affected. In addition to all the other functional domains that I talked about, like cognitive, affective, and autonomic domains. So in this figure, you can see on the bottom right, it is the Tamil word Sri Rama Jayam, written by a normal person, normal aged person in the top, and in the picture below, you see the same thing written by a PD person. So you see that handwriting is generally much smaller in a PD person compared to a normal age-matched normal individual. So how does basal ganglia work? What does it do? So if you look at the classical view, right, basically it goes something like this. So there are, like I said, two pathways in basal ganglia. There's a direct pathway from striatum to the GPI. There's a longer pathway, the indirect pathway going from striatum to GPE to ST and to GPI. Now, so like I said, the neurons of SNC release a chemical called dopamine, and these neurons project to striatum. And dopamine released by SNC to the striatum acts like some kind of a switch that controls the routing of information that is coming from the cortex to striatum, right? So this dopamine levels in striatum decide whether this cortical information to the striatum goes straight up via the direct pathway to the GPI, or goes via the longer route of the indirect pathway, right, via the GP, STN, and then goes to GPI. So because there is a certain interesting cellular machinery in striatum, which I'm not going to describe now for want of time, right, which translates the dopamine signal and controls the routing of the information, cortical information, via direct or indirect pathways. So basically what happens is when the dopamine levels in striatum are high, then the direct pathway gets activated, and when the direct pathway gets activated, movement is facilitated, or you get to go, you get to move, right, when the direct pathway is activated. So similarly, when the indirect pathway is activated, movement is inhibited. So that's like a no-go, you're prevented from moving or going. So therefore, the direct pathway is sometimes also called the go pathway, which is activated when under conditions of high dopamine, and the indirect pathway is also sometimes called the no-go pathway, which is activated when the dopamine levels are low in the striatum. So this is a kind of a classical picture which you will encounter if you look at any standard textbook of neurology or a basic neurobiology textbook. Now, dopamine is a very important chemical. It's what is called a neuromodulator released by this cluster of neurons. There is SNC, which you have just seen. There's another cluster called the VTA or ventral tegmental area. These neurons project to wide-ranging targets, both in the subcortex and also in the cortex, right? And dopamine is called a pleasure chemical in the brain because release of dopamine by these dopamine clusters occurs under conditions of brain stimulation or psychomotor stimulants, like when you take drugs of like when you take stimulants or opiates, and even food can activate dopamine release. So addictive drugs can cause dopamine release, and that's why these drugs are create a sense of pleasure. And then dopamine antagonists, that is substances which counteract the effect of dopamine, that attenuate the pleasurable experience of the above. So that shows that basically dopamine produces pleasure, and the dopamine antagonists kind of attenuate that pleasure. In addition, presentation of beautiful faces or images of lovers or presentation of monetary rewards, right, all this can also trigger the dopamine system. So the dopamine cells are known to be part of a much larger circuit, a reward system, a reward circuit in the brain, right? And the dopamine signal basically indicates that the organism or the human being has received a pleasurable stimulus. So dopamine. So there is a simple conclusion that you can come to based on the previous set of facts, is that dopamine represents reward, right, for the animal. In fact, there is a much more sophisticated description or interpretation of the dopamine signal, but I'm not going through all of that right now. So basically, if you have a signal in the brain which represents reward, that can be used for learning or learning of a special kind called reinforcement learning. So what is reinforcement learning? It's a kind of learning that determines stimulus response association. So a very simple kind of learning constitutes producing a response in response to a stimulus. So think of the agent as or an organism as a black box, and give a stimulus to it and produce a response. Now, when the animal produces this response, if it gets reward from the environment, that next time around the animal will try to produce the same response for that stimulus. Or on the other hand, if the animal gets punishment from the environment for the same response, next time around for that stimulus it will try to avoid that response. To give an example, let us say animal sees some kind of a maybe red object, right, in the environment and thinks it's a food object or a pleasurable object and goes ahead and eats it. If it turns out to be really a very nutritive food object, then the connection between the stimulus and response that gets strengthened, and next time around if it sees the same kind of an object, it'll go ahead and eat it. But suppose that red object turns out to be some kind of a harmful bug, right, and that causes the animal some kind of a pain. So the next time around it will try to avoid that response. So basically a stimulus response association, if it leads to reward, that association is strengthened, and if it leads to punishment, that association is weakened. So that is basically in essence what reinforcement learning is. Now basal ganglia is very well poised in the nervous system to perform reinforcement learning, because if you look at its anatomical position in the brain, it receives input from the sensory motor cortex. It also receives input from the SNC. So from sensory motor cortex, it receives input about the stimulus and also the response, because stimulus comes from the sensory cortex and response information comes from the motor cortex. So basically it receives both these kinds of information from the cortex. It also gets the reward information or its negative punishment information from SNC. So it combines these two, which is like what is happening in this simple schematic. So there is a box here which has information about the stimulus, response, and reward or punishment, which is basically a negative reward. Right, so this basically is like that box, and it has access to all these three kinds of information, and it combines these three kinds of information and sends output back to the cortex, to the motor cortex specifically, right, instructing it whether it should go ahead and do the same response next time, or should try to avoid that response next time. So it is anatomically well positioned to perform reinforcement learning. Actually, there's a lot more to be said about this, in fact, but in this simple description, I cannot give more information at this time. So when you choose from several responses, right, and you want to figure out what is the response which leads to reward and what is the response which leads to punishment, right, to illustrate that, let us look at a simple schematic here. Let's say there's an animal here which is faced with two choices in the form of two buttons. There's a yellow button and the red button. If it presses yellow button, it gets a reward in the form of a juice, or if it presses the red button, it gets punishment in the form of, let's say, electric shock. Okay, initially it doesn't know that yellow is means reward and the red means punishment, so it just goes ahead and just initially presses yellow, right? And when it presses yellow, it gets a reward. So then it understands that yellow means good. So it has imagine that it has some kind of a prior or a weightage for yellow. So when it realizes that yellow leads to reward, right, its weightage for yellow goes up, and see that yellow bar is going up when it gets reward after pressing yellow. So then it presses red, right? It doesn't know initially that red is bad, so it has some kind of intermediate level of weightage for red. That's the red bar that you see over there. It presses the red button and then gets this little shock. So it now understands that red is bad. So the weightage that it gives to red goes down. So imagine the animal doing this over and over again a few times, right? And as it does it a few times, the weightage for yellow goes to some kind of a maximum because it knows that yellow is good, and the weightage for the red goes to minimum or zero because it realizes that that red is bad. Okay, so at the end of that kind of experience or sampling of these various choices, the animal realizes that yellow is good. So therefore, you should go ahead and make that choice. That is like your the function of the go pathway in basal ganglia, and realizes that red is bad, and therefore you should not press red. So that's like the function of the no go pathway in basal ganglia. But having simply go and no go is in itself is not a complete strategy for optimal decision making. The animal should also be able to try out and look for other options or other kind of buttons which may exist, right, which will give you maybe perhaps a better reward than what it has already seen. Okay, in this figure you don't see other buttons, but if you take a real world example like going to restaurants, so typically just consider how you would go to a restaurant. So maybe there you have certain favorite restaurants which you always visit, right, because whenever you go there you get a kind of a happy experience. So these are like the go examples, right, that we have seen here. Or there could be other restaurants where you always had unhappy experience because food is bad and you end up being sick and so on. These are like your no-go restaurants. But then if you want to think of a optimal strategy for going always to a good restaurant, right, here you have all the known restaurants to be good, and then the restaurants that you know to be bad. But if you want to optimize your experience of going to good restaurants, this is not enough because there could be other restaurants which you have never sampled, right? Unless you you are willing to go to other restaurants which you have never been to and explore them, right? Your experience of maximizing your pleasure of going to a restaurant is not complete. So trying out these new restaurants which you have never been to, like once in a while, trying out such new restaurants is called exploration. So if you want to have a comprehensive decision making policy, right, for maximizing your reward that you get as you perform various and choose various actions, you need to have three things. You need to be able to go to those choices which you know to be good, and you should know that you should not choose, or you should not go towards choices which you know to be bad, and then you should be willing to also try out new actions which you have never sampled, and that's called explore. Okay, so basically these are the kinds of ideas or concepts that you encounter in reinforcement learning. So it involves a reward signal, because only when you get a reward or punishment, right, you will know whether the action is good or bad. Then there are values. These are the weightages that we were talking about earlier, which are like surrogates to reward, because reward is something that you get after you performed an action, but you want to know a priori whether an action leads to reward or not. And those weightages that you build after sampling the action several times, these are called values. Then you should be willing to explore, right, and see if there are other actions which you have never explored, never sampled, which might even give you greater reward than what you've already seen with these known actions. Then you should perform actions, and there should be a state. So for example, here you should be able to look at the yellow button and red button and distinguish that this is yellow and this is red, and that's the state. So how do all these concepts apply to the the architecture of basal ganglia? Let's look at that. So the state information about the yellow button and red button, all this comes from the sensory cortex, which is very simple. The reward information comes from the SNC, because like we said right in the beginning, that the SNC neurons release dopamine, and dopamine represents pleasure. Then the values or weightages are thought to be stored in striatum. There's a lot of evidence from functional neuroimaging which demonstrates that. So I'm not going to review that literature, but we know that values are stored in the striatum. Then go pathway allows you to perform the action or facilitate the action. No go pathway inhibits the action. So where is the exploration happening? So if you, for a comprehensive policy of decision making, right, you need to have go, no go, and also the third regime called the explore. Where is this third regime occurring? So earlier it was not clear where the exploration is happening in the basal ganglia circuitry. So we propose that in the indirect pathway, there are certain properties of cellular dynamics which enables exploration. So with this hypothesis, we are able to perform modeling of and explain a lot of functions of basal ganglia. As you can see in this figure, we are able to model handwriting impairment in Parkinson's disease, reaching performance in Parkinson's, gait impairment in Parkinson's disease, then precision grip, that is how do we hold a small object between the index finger and the thumb, that's called precision grip, and this is affected in again also in Parkinson's disease. Then deep brain stimulation, which is what is used in as a last resort treatment for Parkinson's. Then saccade generation, that is how do we produce these rapid eye movements called saccades, and these movements are affected in certain Parkinson's patients. So then spatial navigation and so on. So all these diverse functions of basal ganglia we are able to model using a single modeling approach, and all this effort has resulted in a book recently. So it's called the Computational Neuroscience Models of the Basal Ganglia. This book summarizes all the work that has happened in our lab in the last 10 years. So next, let us come to modeling neurovascular interaction. Okay, so neurons and vessels talk to each other. So neurons, when they fire, when they perform their spiking activity of producing action potentials, that's a very energy intensive activity. So they release certain chemicals which act on the neighboring vessels and result in dilation of vessels. So vessels dilate and release oxygen and glucose, which is picked up by the neuron, and oxygen and glucose are combined to produce ATP inside the neuron, and the ATP is used to fire all the spiking activity or electrical activity of the neurons. So now, so actually it turns out that there is a intermediate cell called the astrocyte, right, which is a kind of a glial cell, right, which mediates between neurons and the blood vessels and in this interaction. So actually what the astrocytes do is something as follows. So neurons, when they fire, they release a neurotransmitter, like for example glutamate, if it is an excitatory neuron. This glutamate acts on an astrocyte which is in the neighborhood, and astrocytes interestingly also have receptors for that respond to neurotransmitters. That's why astrocytes also form part of the neural information processing circuitry. So astrocytes respond to the glutamate and then release chemicals like vasodilators like say EET, and this vasodilator acts on the vessel and causes vessel dilation or vascular dilation. So when the vessel dilates, it releases that glucose, and the glucose is picked up by the astrocyte, where it is converted to lactate, right? And lactate is then released into the neuron, where it is converted to ATP, and ATP is what is used to run the ionic pumps in the neuron, and which is necessary to maintain the ionic gradients in the neuron, and which is necessary to run the spiking activity of the neuron. So that's how the loop is closed. So basically, you have this intermediate kind of cell, the astrocytes, right, which mediate the exchange of energy and signals between neurons and blood vessels. So one of the first questions with which we started, this whole line of work is, why is there a mediator? Because if you look at other bodily tissues, like for example skin or skeletal muscle, so the local tissue and the blood vessels talk to each other, right, directly. There's no intermediate cells like the glial cells. So for example, if you look at the skeletal muscle, so if you kind of contract your muscle, that muscle is made up of a bundle of muscle fibers, and when the muscle fibers contract, they spend a lot of energy. When they do that, the fiber sends out different vasodilators. These act on the neighboring vessels, and the vessels dilate and release oxygen and glucose, which is picked up by the muscle fiber and used for the contractile activity. There is no intermediate cell coming between the muscle fiber and the blood vessels. So why do we need astrocytes in the nervous system? Okay, so to answer this question, we proposed a very simple scheme, or we converted this question into something slightly related. So imagine two different situations. Suppose I have a neuron here. So in the picture here, you see a blue circle, that is a neuron, and the red circle is a blood vessel. Suppose you have a simple one-to-one relationship between a neuron and a blood vessel. So the neuron is firing away and then sends out these signals to the blood vessel. In response to the signal from the hunger signal from the neuron, the blood vessel dilates and releases glucose, which is picked up by the neuron, and the neuron uses the glucose for its firing activity. If we had this kind of a simple one-to-one relationship between neurons and blood vessels, life would have been very simple. But that's not how things work in the brain, because there are a lot of neurons and a lot of blood vessels. And when a neuron is active and sends out this vasodilator, right, that the dilator acts on lots of blood vessels in the neighborhood. Similarly, when a blood vessel dilates, the glucose that is released in that process goes to many different neurons in the neighborhood. So here you have an interesting problem which arises when you look at this whole interaction from an engineering point of view. So in the second picture, or the picture in the middle, right, you see kind of a big blue circle and a small blue circle. The big blue circle denotes a neuron which has very high energy demands. Maybe it has a very high firing rate, and so it needs a lot of energy. Whereas the small circle represents a neuron with very low activity. Maybe it's most of the time silent, so its energy demands are much lesser. Now similarly, there's a big red circle and a small red circle. The big red circle is a blood vessel which is dilated, and a small red circle is an undilated blood vessel. So when the blood vessel dilates, right, the energy that is released goes to both the active neuron and inactive neuron. Right. Similarly, so thing is, when the neuron that is more active, right, it should on the whole receive more energy from the blood vessels than neuron which is not very active. So if everybody talks to everybody, right, how do you make sure that the neurons which are more hardworking, have more energy demand, right, get more energy inputs in the form of, right, lactate or ATP or glucose or whatever. So this is a very simple question with which we began, right. So basically, since neurons have varied energy demand levels, right, there must be some kind of a mechanism by which the total input into the neuron, which from other neurons, which determine their activity levels, right. So the activity levels of the neuron, which determines their energy demand pattern, must be matched by the energy feedback pattern. So because the energy from the blood vessels goes into the glia, and then from glia transform this energy into some other form, like for example lactate, which is then supplied to the neurons. So you see that the input into the neurons from the top, which is shown as input pattern, determine the energy demand pattern in the neural layer. Then the feedback from the glial cells, which is shown as the green arrow, is energy feedback pattern. So if the brain is designed so as to optimize the energy utilization, then the energy demand pattern and the energy feedback pattern should match well. That is, neurons which are more hardworking, have higher energy demands, should get more energy influx into them. So how do you design this network so that this kind of a matching pattern, the matching of energy demand and energy supply, right, takes place? So this is what we have started off. We began the whole journey with by invoking this kind of a simple engineering principle. So I won't go into details of the model that we have proposed in response, to realize this kind of a matching. But we proposed two different network architectures. In one architecture, there is a Basal layer and a neural layer talking to each other directly. There is no intermediate layer of the glial cell. In the other layer, other architecture, we have three layers. There is a Basal layer, glial layer, and the neural layer. Input is given to the neural layer, and then there is information goes further to the glial cells. From glial cells, it goes to the vessels, and then the feedback from vessel cells, from the vessels, goes to the glial layer. From glial layers, it goes back to the neural layers, and that's how the loop is closed. So we train these two networks to store some simple patterns. In this case, the small images, simple images of numbers like handwritten numbers. So here three examples are shown: 0, 1, and 2. So the row of images at the top are the inputs that are presented to the input layer of these two architectures that you've seen on the previous slides, and the rows of images that are shown below, that is middle and the bottom layers. These are the energy feedback patterns that the neural layer receives from the glial layer. So ideally speaking, the energy feedback pattern should look like the input pattern itself, so that the matching is met, the matching principle is satisfied at every neuron level. But if you see, can very easily see that the middle row and the top row don't look anything like each other. So the energy matching principle is not achieved when you have only two layers and without any glial layer. And in the bottommost row, there is a glial layer, but in this case, the input and output layers are of size 15 by 15, actually 30 by 30, but the glial layer is only 10 by 10. So in this case also there is no matching that is achieved. So we keep on increasing the glial layer size, right? So here in the top layer it is 15 by 15 size glial layer. In the middle layer, the glial layer becomes 20 by 20, and the bottommost layer it becomes 30 by 30. So as we keep on increasing the number of glial cells in this model, that is the size of the glial layer, right, the matching principle is progressively achieved. So in the bottommost layer, for example, you can see that the energy feedback pattern is matching very closely with the input pattern to the neural layer. And to achieve that, we did two things. We increased the glial layer to a sufficiently large size, and also to train this network, we had to train all the connections, and the connections here are of many kinds. If we look at the right architecture, and the architecture on the right side, the connections are there are connections into the neural layer. From neural to glial, that's one kind of connection. Glial to vessel, second kind of connection. Then vessel back to the glial, third kind of connection. And glial back to the neuron, that's fourth kind of connection. So all these connections are trained using what is called Hebbian learning. Okay, so we need to do these two things: train all the connections using Hebbian learning, and also we have to make the glial layer sufficiently large. Only then the network worked. Now, what is the conclusion or implication of this, right, from a biological point of view? Now we know from the course that variation in synaptic strength is called plasticity, right? And very often we have seen that the ongoing activity in the synapse controls its plasticity, which is called, therefore it is called the activity dependent plasticity. Now plasticity is normally attributed only to synapses, that is to the interactions among neurons. But in our model, we have assumed plasticity among several other connections which are not neural connections at all. So we have proposed that there is plasticity going on at two other points. One is in the connection between, so as you can see in this figure, in the connection between the neurons and the astrocytes, there is plasticity, and also in the connection between astrocytes and the blood vessels, the capillaries, also there is plasticity. Okay, so one more thing is that there is this activity dependent neuron astrocyte ratio. That is, we have shown in the model that unless the glial layer or astrocyte layer is sufficiently large, the network could not learn to respond to the patterns. Okay, so is there any evidence for that? No. Here are two studies which we are quoting. So for example, local density of glial cells is an indicator of the metabolic demand of the local neural tissue. That is from the first study by Sherwood et al. 2006. And also glial neuron ratio increases with higher environmental enrichment and stimulation. So if you raise an animal under environmentally rich, stimulation rich environments, right, the glial neuron ratios are higher under those conditions, which is what we also see in this model. Okay, so from this kind of a basic model, we have done more detailed models also, which I'm not describing here, and we can look at some of our publications. But some of the ideas that emerge out of this line of modeling is as follows. So we believe and propose that brain's computations are performed not just by the neurons, but by coordinated function of three networks consisting of the neural network, the network of astrocytes, and the cerebrovascular network. So all these three networks are working together to perform brain's computations. In the current mainstream thinking in neuroscience, it is generally assumed that some kind of a master-slave relationship between neurons and blood vessels. That is, neurons are active and they send out these hunger signals, and which drive and determine the open-close activity of cerebral vessels. So therefore, you think of the cerebral vessel as activity as simply some kind of a echo of neural activity, but we believe that's not the case, and I think they must be treated as some kind of peer-to-peer networks, right, and working in tandem, and a more comprehensive theory of brain function, right, will probably depend on understanding the interaction between the three networks, neurons, astrocytes, and cerebral vessels. So therefore, we also propose the concept of vascular computation. If all these three networks are working in tandem, then why do we say that neurons alone are processing information in the brain? Why can't we assume that astrocytes are also processing information, and more interestingly, cerebral microvessels are also processing information? So that information processing, we call it vascular computation. So as a part of that broad question, can we ask, do arterioles or small arteries, do they have tuned responses? So for example, if I show an oriented bar, right, and then take recordings from the visual cortex, from the arterioles of visual cortex, will you find a certain arteriole dilating exactly in response to a certain oriented bar at a given orientation? So similarly, are there topographic maps in the cerebral microvasculature of various, right, maybe primary sensory cortices? These are some questions that we need to ponder. There's a lot that can be discussed about this, and in this simple overview, I cannot give more detail beyond this point. Then the third topic we are looking at is modeling hippocampal spatial cells. So we are capable of navigating around the world and finding our way around the world, right? And these spatial navigation capabilities are located in a part of the brain which is located inside the temporal lobe, right? As you can see in this figure, right? Inside temporal lobe there is a organ, there is a circuit called hippocampus, as you can see here, and you can see some of the main fields or clusters of cells within the hippocampal circuit. Our hippocampus receives input from the cortex, like most other subcortical circuits, and this information goes to various hippocampal fields. As you can see in this picture, there is CA1, CA3, DG stands for dentate gyrus, right? And information goes back to the cortex, right? The input port to the hippocampus is called the entorhinal cortex, or EC, shown in this picture, and then from EC information goes through various hippocampal fields and goes back to the cortex via EC. Now there are certain cells in hippocampus which respond to the properties of surrounding space. These are called spatial cells, and these discovery of spatial cells goes back to even 70s. But recently this spatial cell work has got a lot of attention because the 2014 Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine was given to this work, to the spatial cell discovery in hippocampus. Therefore, hippocampus is called the GPS of the brain. Primarily, there are two kinds of spatial cells. There are what are called place cells, discovered by John O'Keefe and his colleagues in the 70s, and these are cells which are active whenever the animal is found in certain location inside the maze. And then there are what are called grid cells, which respond whenever the animal is located at one of those spatial locations which have a periodic structure. So it's very interesting how these kinds of cellular responses emerge out of an experience of the animal with the surrounding space in the surrounding spatial world. So people have proposed computational models. So I'll talk about some of the modeling work that we have done in this area. So there are three kinds of spatial cells that are important to discuss. There's place cells, grid cells, and then head direction cells. So place cells are the neurons which fire when the animal is at a certain specific place in the environment. And so this was discovered by John O'Keefe and Dostrovsky in '71. So this video illustrates or explains what a place cell is like. So in this case, the rat is moving around in a small black box. The walls of the box are all dark except on one side you can see that there is a white card called a cue card. So then recordings are constantly being done from the hippocampus of the animal. So you can see that wire that is sticking out of the animal's brain. So red dots that you see are actually the points where the neurons are firing, right inside hippocampus. So you see that whenever the animal goes to that corner, that part of the box, the neurons are firing. So these are typically place cells. So a lot of computation models have been proposed, but so some of these models assume make certain unnatural assumptions, right, which are sort of biologically infeasible. So also some of these models are dedicated exclusively to certain kinds of spatial cells, and they don't present a comprehensive picture of how all the different kinds of spatial cells like head direction cells, grid cells, and place cells, how all of them emerge in the same modeling framework. So that is what we have taken as an objective for our modeling effort. So our first model in this case, in this case, consists of three layers. There is what is called head direction layer. So head direction cells are basically cells which respond whenever the animal is heading in certain direction. So then the output of the head direction cells goes to another layer called path integration layer. So path integration basically consists of how the animal integrates its velocity information to find out its displacement. So basically your displacement is basically integral of the velocity, right? So there is thought to, so hippocampus is thought to have a role in performing path integration to find out to compute its position. Okay, so I won't go into the modeling details, but we were able to, the model is able to explain the emergence of grid cells, not only the hexagonal grid cells, but the model shows emergence of grid cells of other kinds of symmetries. Like for example, if you look at the panel number 3, right, it shows 4 different firing fields, right, which are organized like a square. Okay, so the firing fields 5 and 6 are hexagonal grids, right, because they form a hexagon, and actual grid cells are very often hexagonal in structure. But we get other kinds of periodicities also in our model. Okay, so as you can see both square and hexagonal grid cells in this picture. And then in the next model, we also combined both vision and proprioception, or this path integration. And not going into the modeling details, again we got different kinds of periodicities, right? And so in the second model, we had 2 layers. In the first layer, we found more grid cells, like what you see here. In the second layer, we found more like place cells. That is, we found more cells which respond to only one location. So in the first layer, we found cells which responded to multiple locations, and then all these locations form some kind of a periodic spatial structure. Whereas in the second layer, we often found cells which respond to only one or sometimes even 2, right, locations, which are more similar to place cells. Then we also applied these methods to modeling 3D navigation. So with this data that we got from Michael Yartsev of University of California, Berkeley, regarding 3D data from bats engaged in 3D navigation. So in this case, you see that the place cells now are in 3D. So because the animal moves in 3D space, there are certain cells which fire whenever the animal is in certain volume, right, in the 3D space, and you can see examples of 3 spatials, 3D place cells here. So we propose a similar kind of architecture in this case, and again we found in this case also the model showed place cells in the 3D space, and in addition we also found plane cells. That is, these are cells which fire whenever the animal is located or whose motion is confined to a certain plane. So we feel that plane cells are important, have a certain significance because they can indicate so a certain height at which the animal is flying. So that will let the animal determine its altitude. And then there are also cells which fire at multiple planes. We call them multiple plane coding cells. Okay, so you can see examples of such kind of cell here. So in summary, we find we developed a model of spatial navigation in both 2D and 3D, and the same model explains emergence of a variety of spatial cells, like for example grid cells, place cells, and this is done both, and also directional cells, and it's also done in both 2D and 3D navigation. So finally, I want to briefly talk about this work that we are doing, a very exciting work. So it's called, we've developed a script called Bharti script, right? This is nothing to do with computational neuroscience. We are doing it more like a hobby, as a separate, as an aside, in addition to the neuroscience work that we are doing. So in India, we have lots of languages. We have 22 official languages, and actually there are about 600 languages, right, spoken by many small communities all over the country. And we have 11 major scripts. So for example, you have Hindi, the language is written in Devanagari script. Then Gurmukhi is a script used to write Punjabi language. Then Bengali and Assamese have about the same script. Then you have Gujarati. These are all the Devanagari family of scripts used in the northern part of India. And then there is Oriya somewhere in the center, which has its own script. Then you have Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, and Malayalam, the 4 major scripts of South India. Then we have Urdu and English, which are used everywhere in India. Now, if you take the literacy rate of about 75%, about 900 million people are dealing with all these scripts. So now in India we have many languages, and each language has typically its own unique script, like for example Hindi and Devanagari, or Kannada and Kannada, Telugu and Telugu, and so on. But that doesn't have to be that way, because if you look at Western Europe, there are lots of languages like English, French, German, Italian, and so on. All of them use the same script, the same Roman script, but for some small technical or cosmetic differences, all the scripts are nearly identical, right? So the question is, in India, can we have such a situation where there are many languages, but they all follow the same script? Because in India, language definitely pose a communication barrier, but scripts pose an additional barrier, because very often, right, I don't have to know the script to get that certain kinds of information. Like for example, if I am trying to find a certain shop, or name of a street, or name of a city, or name of a train station, I don't need to know the local script. But that's what happens typically in India when you go from state to state, right? Unless you know the local script, you cannot. It's very hard to find your way around in a different state. Okay, so in addition to having a lot of scripts, our scripts are pretty complicated, pretty complex, and that's partly because of this interesting feature called composite characters. Just consider how you would write the words three in English, right? It's three, the Hindi words three can be written as STREE in English. Okay, so same thing if you write in Hindi script or Devanagari script, it looks something like what you see on the right side. So you take the letter Sa, right, and then the letter Ta and letter Ra, right? Then you morph them and then just amalgamate them into a complex structure and take the vowel E, right, and also morph that into this kind of a arc-like shape and squish them all together and create a very complex structure called Stree. So this is called such a character, which is a composite of multiple basic characters, is called a composite character or a samyuktakshar. And because of this feature, although the basic characters in Hindi are only about 50 plus, right, because of this kind of a combinatorics, right, you end up with a very large number of characters. In fact, a typical Indian language, if you leave alone Tamil, which is a very simple organization, right, typical Indian language has about 10,000 or more than 10,000 characters. So which makes our writing system very complicated. So scripts are beautiful and complex, as you can see in some of these images, but they're also quite confusing because very often similar sounding letters have very dissimilar shapes, or very dissimilar sounding letters have very similar shapes. So for example, in this slide, you can see the Telugu characters Ra and Ta which are actually very different phonetically. They look very similar in terms of their visual shape. Similarly, the Kannada characters E and Ñ, which one is a vowel, one is a consonant, they look very similar. So there you can see other examples in this slide. So is it possible to have a simple and a single script, a common script for the entire country? It is basically possible because basically all the scripts have very similar phonetic organization. So they all have vowels like A, I, E and so on. Then there are consonants, Ka, Kha, Ga, Ga and so on. Then there are consonant vowel combinations or Barakadi, which is called Barakadi in Hindi. These are Ka, Ka, Ki, Ki and so on. And then you have Samyuktakshars or consonant conjuncts, which consist of multiple consonants and a single vowel. So all the scripts other than Tamil, which are simpler organization, right, share the same kind of phonetic organization. So it is in principle possible to unify them. But only thing is, what you need to reform the script design is to make sure that the sound and shape match very strictly. That is, they should satisfy this principle that similar sounds must have similar shapes and dissimilar sounds must have dissimilar shapes. Okay, so what do you mean by that? Let me give a small example. Who is the 47th Kaurava? Now we know that Kauravas are this evil clan of princes from Mahabharata. We know some of these names like Duryodhana, Dushasana and all that, but it's very hard to remember all the 100 names. So it's very hard to remember the name of the 47th Kaurava. Actually his name is Kundadhara, but if you had you named the Kauravas simply as K1, K2 and K3 and so on, right, the 47th Kaurava would be simply K47. So it's very easy to remember the name if you follow a certain simple notation. So can we do something as simple as that, right, and design a script which is very easy to learn and easy to use? So that's what we have tried with Bharti. So in this slide you see the Devanagari vowels and the Bharti vowels for combination. So Devanagari vowels are seen in black ink and then Bharti vowels are seen in blue. So first of all, you can notice that all the Bharti vowels have the similar look and feel. They all have a common base, which is like a cup-shaped kind of a character, which represents A. So the first letter is A, which is shaped like this, and all other vowels are obtained by or constructed by adding some kind of a diacritics on top. Now vowels are also organized as short form and long form. You have A, E. So you have Hrasva and Dirgha, right, occurring in simple recurrence. So Dirgha in Bharati is always denoted by adding a horizontal line on top. So therefore for A, if you add the horizontal line, you get A. Then for E, you use a circle on top, which makes it E. If you add a small horizontal line to the E ki matra, you get E. Then if you add this U-shaped diacritic on top of A, you get U. If you add a little horizontal tail to it, you get U, and so on and so forth. So you can have an idea of how it works. Now for consonants also it is really possible to simplify it, because the consonants in all Indian languages or writing systems are organized on phonetic lines very beautifully. Like for example, the rows of the table of consonants, like Ka, Kha, Ga, Ga and Cha, 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 Cha and all that, are organized based on the place of articulation. So there are two things that determine the rows and columns of this table: the place of articulation and the manner of articulation. So the Ka, Kha, Ga, Ga are called velars because when you utter them, right, you touch the velum, a part of the oral cavity called velum, right, with your tongue when you utter them. So then Cha, 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 Cha are called palatals because when you utter them, you touch your soft palate inside the oral cavity. Then Ta, Ta, Da, Da are called retroflexes because when you utter them, you fold your tongue backwards, ta, right, and therefore they are called retroflexes. Then Ta, Tha, Da, Da are called dentals because when you utter them, you touch your teeth with your tongue. And Pa, Pa, Ba, Ba are called labials because you close your lips when you utter them. So this is the logic of each of these rows. Then there's a logic, there's a phonetic logic underlying the columns also, because if you look at the first column, Kaka, Kachata Tapa, the second column is obtained by adding an extra breath of air. It's called aspiration. So for example, Ka, Kha, Cha, Cha. So you are basically adding an extra breath of air called aspiration. So to get the second column from the first column, you add aspiration. Now to get the third column from the first column, you activate your vocal cords. So to get Ga from Ka, you're activating your vocal cords. To get Ja from Cha, you're activating your vocal cords. So this is called voicing. Now to get the fourth column, right? To get gha from ka, you are doing two things. You are adding extra breath of air or aspiration. You're also activating your vocal cord, that's voicing. So basically, if you look at the first column, it has a very simple binary code. The first column is 0 0, second column is 0 1, third column is 1 0, and fourth column is 1 1. Okay, so that's the pattern that you see in all the first four columns. And the fifth column is called, they are all nasals. It is the nasalized version of the first column is the fifth column. So if this beautiful phonetic logic is reflected in the shape of the letters, they become much easier to memorize and use. So after that you have the semi-vowels ya, ra, la, la, va, and then you have sibilants, the sa, sha, sha, and then you have the whispers, which is ha. Okay, so let us look at the Bharti consonants. So you see that the blues on the right are the Bharti consonants. So you have, let's take the first five characters of the first column, ka, cha, ta, ta, pa. So the ka is actually a morphed version of the Hindi ka or Devanagari ka. Cha is also borrowed from Hindi cha. Ta is borrowed from Tamil, and ta is again from Hindi, and pa is borrowed from Tamil. So the first five you have to choose, and as a semi in some sort of random fashion. Once you choose the first five, the others can be derived pretty systematically. The second column is obtained, like I said, by adding aspiration. So you add dot below to denote aspiration. So you do the same thing for all the five characters in the second column. You take the first column character and add a dot below, you get second column characters. To get the third column, you add a small bar below, because bar below denotes voicing. So you get ga, ja, da, da, ba, you get simply by adding a bar to the first column characters. Then the fourth column, gha, jha, dha, and so on, can be obtained by adding both a bar and a dot, because that's like adding both aspiration and voicing. The fifth column, which are nasals, we have handled them slightly differently. We didn't follow the same logic because the picture gets too cluttered if you add one more notation to take care of the nasals. Then you have ya, ra, la, la, va, and sa, sha, sha. Since they form a series, we denoted them using like adding bars below. So the plain sa is just that S-shaped character, and sa as in Shiva is obtained by adding one bar below sa, and sha as in Visesh is obtained by adding two bars below sa, and then last character is ha. So once you have the consonants and vowels, the Bharakhadi or consonant vowel combination is simply obtained by adding this vowel matra in Bharati on top of the consonant. So here you can see that the shape like this denotes ka, and by adding all the matras, the vowel matras from the vowels, that you get the entire ka Bharakhadi. And you do the same thing for all the other consonant vowel combinations also. So basically the Bharati characters are made up of only these simple shapes. We have 18 main shapes and then 20 matras, and on the whole there are around 38 shapes. And with this small set of very simple shapes, you can construct anything in any of the major Indian languages. So which makes it a very simple script to learn. And with this you can construct words in any Indian language. And we are producing primers, very simple books that will let you read basic words in various languages. So they look like the basic picture books that look like this. And here is a study that we have done with a school in Anantapur district in Andhra Pradesh. So after 6 days of instruction, that too only 1 hour instruction in the evening, right, the kids in this small group, this study was done by a teacher called Meda Prasad. So these kids in this small group were able to write essays and poetry after about 6 hours of instruction. Okay, and here is a kid who has written the national anthem in Bharti. So we have developed software tools for facilitating use of Bharati. So if you have a document which is already written in Unicode in any Indian language, you can just convert it to Bharati at a click of a button. But here is a Tamil document which you can convert to Bharati. Right, or a Malayalam document which you can convert to Bharati. Right, so conversion is very simple. And then we also have developed a online handwritten character recognition engine. So where if you write with electronic pen on a tablet, right, it recognizes what you have written and show the output in actual fonts. So this can be used for on a mobile for for more efficient messaging, because normally people use Google keyboard, but we have put out an app called Bharti handwriting keyboard. It's on Google Play Store. So with this, if you can learn Bharati, you write your text in Bharati, and the app recognizes what you have written and sends a message in Indian language or Indian language fonts. Bharti is also ideal for optical character recognition, because when you do OCR on any text, so especially for Indian languages, it poses some interesting challenges, because if you look at the character Bha, for example, shown in this slide, that Bha consists of the vowel A and the consonant Bha. Right, both the consonant vowel parts are combined in one continuous image in this character. Whereas in Bharati, in this figure, you can see that there are 4 distinct components. There is this cup-like shape, which is Pa, and then the horizontal bar on top denotes the vowel A, and then the vertical bar below and along with the dot converts Pa into Bha. Okay, so you can identify each of these different components by using an algorithm called connected component analysis, which is a very standard algorithm in OCR, and then you can very easily recognize the underlying character in this image. So OCR technology works very well with Bharati characters, and you get very high accuracy. So we are also designing games to popularize Bharati. So here is a word building game called Word Wars, which we have developed, and we have worked with the local school children, and they really enjoyed working with this game. We also developed mobile games. So here is a game called Bharati Jumble Tumble. It's also in Play Store. You can take a look at it. So basically, a word is shown in a jumbled form, right? And then you have to move the pieces around in this game and reconstruct the word. So in summary, the Bharati facilitates literacy. I strongly believe that, because it's a very simple script. You can learn it in 10 minutes. In fact, we have released a video that says learn Bharati script in 10 minutes. So it's much easier to learn than our existing scripts. And hopefully, if we adopt a simple script like this and a single script, it facilitates migration across the country. Because so in these days when there's a lot of mobility of people for the reasons of employment, so when a person goes to a new state, usually you learn the local language orally by talking to people, but it's very hard to learn a new script as an adult. But if you have a simple and a single script, that makes the script barrier, it eliminates the script barrier, it makes it easy to learn the script and makes migration easier. It also gives you entry into world of Indian literature, because if you have any document in the digital form, we already have tools for converting it automatically into Bharati. So especially if a next generation young individual, if he or she has trouble learning the mother tongue or the script of the mother tongue, or knows the language orally, right, and we can facilitate reading literature in that language, because we can convert that document into Bharati script. It encourages tourism, because it's if you have all signboards written in a simple script which everybody can understand, right, it encourages tourism. We also did a study which showed that when you write the same set of words in Bharati as opposed to other Indian scripts, you save ink, because the area that you occupy is much lesser, right, in Bharati compared to other Indian scripts. And also it promotes communication across the country, because always the language barrier is there. There's no easy solution to that, but at least can we remove the script barrier by using a very simple and a single script. So with that, I think I conclude my discussion of some of the activities going on in the lab. There are several other activities which I didn't mention. One recent effort is to model brain function in conditions of stroke, right, which I didn't talk about that. And here we are collaborating with several others. We're also doing some work on modeling the visual system, right, how certain aspects of visual system. I didn't talk much about that. So if you're interested, you can send me a mail, you can contact me, and I'll be happy to give more information on our activities. Thank you.